So before the pandemic, I would have said that the city has a pretty healthy transportation network. Certainly needed some maintenance investment and things like that, the CTA and things like that. And on the accessibility side, there's a lot of CTA rail stations that still don't have elevators. But again, back before the pandemic, the CTA created a plan to address that over the next 20 years, right? With priorities and plans to outfit the remaining stations with access. So I think before the pandemic, I was feeling pretty good about where things are at. I was a little worried about where the money was going to come from to get some of those investments done, right? But again, now the pandemic, we have money flowing, so that's not necessarily the problem. It's the question of where's the money going to go, right? Is it going to be distributed equitably? Is it going to be spent on projects that really impact people's lives every day all around the city, right?
In other parts of the city, particularly the south and west side, I don't really know how much has changed in terms of making it more accessible for people transit-wise, and also tying that with affordable housing. I can't think of a lot of examples that aren't on the north side, especially in this part of the city. And I spent a lot of time on the southwest side, and I mean, it's still as car dependent as ever. Maybe even more since the pandemic. I don't see anything changing. So yeah, I think there's some progress in parts of the city, and then other parts you wouldn't know the difference year to year because nothing has changed.
Right. Like you said, I mean, you go farther south or farther west, and you get into disinvested neighborhoods really quickly, right? Where the infrastructure was falling apart before all this, and people can't even get to a bus stop safely, so they're not even taking the buses that exist, in those neighborhoods, and that's a problem. That either creates more car dependence, or more often than not, because those are also lower income neighborhoods, people just don't get out. Older adults, people with disabilities just end up shut in, socially isolated. Again, not necessarily because they can't go anywhere, but because they don't feel it's safe, or they're not able to navigate broken sidewalks, broken intersections to get anywhere. So, there's this huge problem of disinvestment that cascades on itself and creates that situation for people, again, especially on the south and west side. So, I whether it's through the ETOD program that the city's launching, the Elevated has helped with, or whether it's the mayor's Invest Southwest program. Again, there's a lot of talk and at least some resources going towards addressing some of these problems, but like the devil's always in the details, right? There's this gap, I think, between the ideal of what actually is that it's going to take good policy, it's going to take good investment, but it's going to take helping people understand that there is benefits that hopefully outweigh the risks in most places. And if there are places where that's not true, then we need to address that risk-reward ratio and fix it, right? Make the investments in other things we need to, whether it's, again, infrastructure or meaningful public safety that doesn't overpolice, right? I mean, there's so many riddles to solve, but we have to keep working on all of them.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to touch on all those nuances that go beyond just the physical train station or the physical bus stop, but all the surrounding aspects of a community and how people interact with mobility and moving around. When we think of transit, sometimes we tend to focus on trains, and granted, if you're working downtown and near a train station, it's great. But buses serve people throughout the city that don't have access to train stations. So I think we need to continue to prioritize speeding up the city's buses. So when I think about where the city needs to go after the pandemic, and as we progress in this next phase of the pandemic, I would love to see more investment in the city's buses. I think we saw that there were people that didn't abandon transit, they couldn't abandon transit, Black and brown essential workers, and I would love to continue to see us make progress in speeding up the city's buses, because they do go in areas that trains don't go. There are a lot of people now, a lot of neighborhoods that aren't served by train stations. My family in Hermosa, which isn't too far from the Blue Line, but you still have to take a bus to the Blue Line. They're not served by a train station. Beaumont Cregan, a lot of the areas where my family frequents and lives, they're not served by an immediate train station. So buses are yes, buses are like the lifeline of my family, and I think the lifelines of a lot of communities that don't have train stations. I also think of how many people also took up biking during the pandemic, and I think there was also a lot of talk of more people on bikes, kind of like biking boom. And I do think a lot about that, how that's also going to play a role in like kind of traffic patterns. I think I'm starting to see less people on bikes now. Maybe we're past that pandemic peak, and the city hasn't invested a lot in like bike infrastructure. And I feel like I've been seeing people say that traffic seems to have come back with like a vengeance. And yeah, if you're on a bike, you're not going to feel particularly safe. And at the height of the pandemic, there was a lot less cars on the road. So I do think about how the city is thinking about continuing to make people feel safe, taking bike rides. If we're really thinking about this kind of post-pandemic age, and taking what happened during the pandemic and continue to like build off of some of those patterns people took up.
I do hope that when we're making decisions about transportation future, transit-oriented development future after the pandemic, that we are thinking, that we are thinking with more than just our heads, right? That we're remembering how it felt to be isolated at the worst points of the pandemic. That what we saw, again, older loved ones go through, especially, right? I mean, I know that a lot of older folks, especially, felt completely isolated because they were most at risk, and even in the really really dark days is like, can I even risk someone coming to my home to bring me a meal, or is that too dangerous, right? So we saw isolation go up for sure, because of that.
I think that's why transportation policy has to go hand in hand with housing policy. And I think it's helpful that we're in Logan Square. There's a lot of interesting examples here where a lot of transportation policy has connected to that housing piece that's really important. And I think for the first time in a long time, I feel like the perception of TOD is changing. I think partly because of the work also of people in this neighborhood really fighting to change what is happening around TOD, actually make it equitable TOD. I think of a lot of those roots of how TOD was taking shape in this neighborhood, and I do see some potential for that to change, and that's excited to think about because, like you were saying, especially in this neighborhood, TOD has not meant accessibility. It's meant luxury housing. It hasn't been for the people, like long-term residents, community. And I hope tide is changing to create actual housing that's transit-oriented for people that, like a low-income working class, long-time residents of Logan Square and other parts of the city.
And I hope that now we more intentionally think about things like multi-generational housing, right? And we think about how do we keep families, whether they're biological families or chosen families, together in places so that there's support for folks who are more vulnerable. Again, I don't really like that word, but I get why people think of it. So again, older adults, disabled people, people who need some degree of socialization just to get life done, right? We need to have housing and housing and like community amenities that make that possible. I hope that we consider that, and we consider how all of that development, again, hopefully intentional development to address that, interfaces with the transportation network, and how we do that equitably.
Yeah, I went a long time without actually like riding transit, and I've started to use it a lot more again. And it definitely dawned on me. I'm like, oh, I miss riding transit, and it helps connect me to things and people that I hadn't been connected to in a long time because of the pandemic. And it definitely has made me reflect that. It's important to people. It's important to our connectivity as people.
The point is I think that people are going to have a lot of reasons they aren't doing things that they don't understand completely. So until we really address some of that, or give people space to address that for themselves, it's going to be hard to, again, predict, at least, right, what the transit usage patterns are going to be, whether people keep moving to the suburbs or if they come back to the city. I mean, there's all these different patterns that have been set during the pandemic that, you know, how far they reverse, or if they reverse, or if a new pattern develops, that is all very unclear to me because of that factors.
Yeah, yeah. I think an equity-based focus on transportation has to acknowledge that trauma, and I don't know how to do that, but I think that's a question we need to at least ask ourselves.